My brother celebrated his $5 victory in court against me. An hour later, the judge called him back. He was laughing. That's the image I can't get out of my head. Even now, years after everything came apart, and then somehow, improbably, came back together. My brother, my older brother, the one who used to let me ride on the back of his bicycle to school when we were kids in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, standing outside that courthouse on a blazing October afternoon in his brand new Italian suit, phone pressed to his ear, laughing so loud that strangers on the sidewalk were turning to look at him. He had just won $5 million from me, his little brother. The person who had spent 30 years building something from nothing, who had driven their mother to chemotherapy every single Thursday, who had let him into a successful business on nothing more than the handshake of family trust. I was still sitting on a wooden bench in the hallway of the Maricopa County Courthouse. My attorney had already packed his briefcase. The court clerks were stacking their folders and talking about lunch. My ex-wife, my first ex-wife, the one I hadn't spoken to in 4 years, had come to watch the proceedings and was now walking out with her new husband. And she had the nerve, the absolute nerve, to give me a small, sad, pitying smile as she passed. The kind of smile you give a stranger at a funeral when you feel genuinely sorry for them but don't know what to say. I wanted to pull the bench over my head like a shell. I wanted to walk out a back door that didn't exist and keep walking until I was somewhere no one knew my name. I wanted to be anyone else in the world at that moment, except the man sitting on that bench with a $5 million judgment against him, and a brother who was outside celebrating on the phone like he'd won the lottery. And the thing that made it almost impossible to breathe, is that I knew I hadn't done what they said I did. I knew it the way you know your own face in the mirror. That knowledge was sitting inside me like a stone, heavy and real and completely useless in that moment, because the jury had spoken and the gavel had come down and the official, public, documented truth was now Richard's version of events and not mine. My name is Daniel Marsh. I am 53 years old. I was born in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and I spent the better part of 3 decades building a construction company from a used pickup truck and a set of tools I bought at an estate sale into a regional firm that employed, at our peak, over 200 people. I coached Little League Baseball for 11 years. I served on the board of a local food bank. I drove my mother to every one of her chemotherapy appointments for 8 months until she passed, because my brother was too busy with his social life to do it consistently, and I wasn't the kind of person who let that slide. I have been married twice. I have 1 son. I have made mistakes in my life, real ones, significant ones, but I have never, not once, stolen a dollar from anyone. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened, not the way a good story is supposed to happen, because the way it actually happened is messier and slower and more painful than any clean narrative I could construct for you. And I think the mess is where the truth lives. My brother's name is Richard Marsh. He is 4 years older than me, which made him 57 at the time of the trial, and for most of my childhood and young adulthood, he was the person I most wanted to be. He was smarter in school, earned better grades without appearing to try, was better with words and better looking, and carried himself with a kind of easy authority that made people listen to him when he walked into a room. He went to the University of Tulsa on a partial academic scholarship while I went to work with our father at 17, learning to pour concrete and frame houses and run electrical and do every kind of physical work that teaches you about the world from the ground up and takes apart your knees by the time you're 40. I never resented Richard for going to college while I went to work. I was proud of him. He was my brother. His success felt like a reflection of something good in both of us. Our father's name was Gerald Marsh. Gerald was a man of very few words and enormous quiet industry. He grew up in Muskogee in a family with almost nothing, and he spent his entire adult life making sure his own family never felt that particular kind of nothing. He worked as a structural inspector for the city for 31 years. He drove the same model of pickup truck, always a Ford, from the time I can remember until the time he couldn't drive anymore. He never took a vacation that involved an airplane. He ate packed lunches his entire career because he said there was nothing wrong with a good sandwich that cost you nothing when a restaurant was going to charge you $12 for the same thing. He was not a man who talked about money or feelings or the future. He just got up every day and did what needed doing and trusted that if you lived that way long enough, you'd be all right. Gerald Marsh died in January of 2015. He was 79 years old, and he went the way he would have wanted. Quickly, at home, in his sleep, on a Tuesday night in the middle of winter, without inconveniencing anyone. When the estate was settled, several months later, it turned out our father had accumulated, through 31 years of city paychecks, packed lunches, no vacations, and 40 years of steady, unglamorous investing, just over $2 million in assets, a paid-off house, 12 acres of land outside Tulsa that had appreciated considerably, a brokerage account that he had fed with small, consistent contributions since 1974. $2 million split two ways, plus the land and the house. I found out later, much later, too late, that Richard had expected significantly more. Not because he had any particular reason to, not because our father had made any promises, but because Richard had a certain picture of himself in his mind, a picture that required a certain level of financial resources to maintain, and the reality of the inheritance didn't match that picture. He never told me any of this directly. Richard was never direct about the things that ate at him. He was the kind of man who accumulated grievances silently, in private, and let them grow in the dark like something you didn't want to find in the basement. By the time you knew the grievance existed, it had been growing for years. Richard and I had started going into business together in 2009. He had been working in business development for a regional real estate company and felt, he said, underutilized. He had the contacts, he said. He had the relationships. He just needed the right vehicle. I had been running a small but successful construction operation for about 6 years at that point, mostly residential work, renovation, and new builds for homeowners in the East Phoenix suburbs, with a reputation that had gotten solid enough that I was starting to get calls about larger commercial projects. My crews were good. My subcontractors trusted me. My clients referred me. What I didn't have was the sales capacity to pursue the bigger contracts I could see sitting right there, one well-placed conversation away. If only I had someone who knew how to have that conversation. The idea was a natural fit, at least on paper. I had the operational expertise and the workforce and the track record. Richard had the sales ability, the client relationships, the ease in front of people with money and authority, and a facility with contracts and negotiations that I respected and knew I could not replicate. Richard was the kind of man who could walk into a room where no one knew him and walk out with 3 business cards and a dinner invitation. That ability is real. It is valuable. I am not built that way, and I knew it, and I was willing to bet a significant portion of my professional future on his version of it being worth what I thought it was worth. We called it Marsh Brothers Construction. We shook hands in my kitchen on a Thursday afternoon in March of 2009, poured ourselves 2 glasses of bourbon from a bottle of Blanton's I had been saving for something worth celebrating, and toasted to what we were building. We talked for 3 hours about the company we were going to create, the kinds of projects we were going to pursue, the kind of culture we were going to build. We talked about our father. Richard said he thought our father would have gotten a kick out of seeing his 2 sons build something together. I agreed, and I believed it, and that belief was not a performance. It was the truest thing in the room. I remember the feeling of that afternoon with more precision than I can account for. The light in the kitchen had been that particular late afternoon gold that you get in Phoenix in the early spring before the heat settles in for good. My first wife was out. The house was quiet, and I sat across the kitchen table from my brother and felt something I had not felt in years. Optimism about the future of the kind that is physical, that you feel in your body the way you feel warmth. We were going to build something, together. The 2 of us, the way our father had built his life, steadily, with integrity, without drama. For 7 years, the company was everything I'd hoped it would be. We grew steadily and deliberately. We earned a reputation for finishing on time and on budget, which in the construction industry is not as common as clients believe or contractors claim. We moved from residential work into commercial construction, picked up our first public contracts around year 3, and by 2014 we had crews working on projects across 4 counties. I hired carefully, trained people who had never worked construction before and taught them a trade, and treated everyone who worked for me the way I had wanted to be treated when I was the guy with the shovel. I paid on time. I told the truth about timelines. I did not bid jobs we couldn't deliver on. We built a reputation, and a reputation in the construction business is the only currency that actually compounds. Richard was excellent at what he did. I want to say this clearly because I don't want this to be a story in which Richard was always a villain, secretly villainous beneath a false surface, because that would not be true, and it would not be fair to the years that came before the years that broke everything. Richard could walk into a room where nobody knew him and within 20 minutes be having a real conversation with the person who mattered most in it. He remembered details. He asked good questions and actually listened to the answers. He made clients feel understood, which is more than half of what clients actually want when they hire a contractor. They want to feel that the person doing the work gets what the project means to them. Richard got that. He was genuinely good at his work, and the company was genuinely better for his being in it. We disagreed sometimes about money, about hiring, about which contracts to pursue, the ordinary disagreements of any 2 people building something together. But I never doubted that we were working toward the same thing. Not for the first 7 years. The inheritance changed something in Richard that I didn't see until it was too late. I know this now. I can trace the shift backward through the years and find the precise fault line, the moment when his relationship to the company, to me, to what we had built together, underwent some quiet internal reorganization. He started keeping score in a way he hadn't before. He started making comments about his contribution versus mine, subtle at first, the kind of thing you can tell yourself you misheard. He started positioning himself in meetings in ways that suggested the business was primarily his creation, and I was the operational muscle he employed. These things happened slowly, the way erosion happens. You don't see the shape of the land changing. You just wake up one day and the creek has moved. In 2017, he came to me with a formal proposal. He had a document, an actual document with charts and appendices, arguing that the company's revenue was disproportionately dependent on client relationships he had developed, and that this disproportionate contribution warranted a restructuring of the equity split. He wanted to move from 50-50 to 65-35 in his favor. I read the document carefully. Then I put it down and I told him no. I told him I understood he felt strongly about this, but that I disagreed with his analysis. I told him the company worked because of what both of us brought to it, and that the operational infrastructure I had built, the crews, the relationships with subcontractors, the project management systems, the safety record, was not simply labor in service of his vision, but an equal foundation of what we had. I told him I was willing to sit down with a third-party mediator if he wanted a neutral perspective. But I was not going to sign a document that erased 15% of my ownership in a company I had poured my adult life into. He smiled. He said he understood. He said we'd talk more later. We never did talk more later. Not about that. Because 18 months after that conversation, I received a phone call from my attorney telling me that Richard had filed a 47-page lawsuit against me in Maricopa County Superior Court. I laughed when I first heard that. I want to be honest about that. My initial reaction was laughter because it seemed so improbable, so disproportionate to anything that had actually happened between us that my brain genuinely could not accept it as real. A lawsuit from Richard against me. Because I had said no to giving him a bigger piece of the company we had built together. The complaint alleged 4 categories of wrongdoing. First, that I had systematically diverted company funds for personal use over a period of approximately 4 years. Second, that I had manipulated financial records to conceal this diversion. Third, that I had excluded Richard from material business decisions in violation of our partnership agreement. And fourth, the claim that stopped my laughter cold and left me sitting on the edge of my bed with a feeling I had no word for, that I had stolen intellectual property. Specifically, that I had misappropriated a proprietary construction bidding software system that Richard claimed he had developed independently before joining the company, and that I had incorporated it into our business operations without his consent, and then deliberately obscured its origins in order to dilute his ownership claim. My wife, Sarah, was standing in the doorway of our bathroom with her toothbrush in her hand, watching my face while my attorney talked. When I hung up, she asked me what happened. I told her. She sat down on the edge of the bed next to me, and we sat there for a while in a silence that had a particular weight to it. the weight of two people realizing that their life is about to become something harder than they planned for. I told her it would be fine. I told her the truth would be obvious. I told her no court in the country was going to find me liable for stealing from my own brother when I hadn't stolen anything. I believed every word of it when I said it. I had never been through serious litigation before. I did not understand, could not yet understand, how much the truth depends on how it's presented, who presents it, and how much money you have available to present it with. The case took 3 years. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 3 years. In the life of a business, 3 years of active litigation is like carrying a 200-pound pack on a long-distance hike. You can do it, but it reshapes you. It slows every step. It changes the way you breathe. It changes what you're able to think about, because some portion of your mind is always occupied by the case, by the depositions, by the documents being requested and reviewed and argued over, by the constant low-level awareness that your professional reputation and your financial stability are balanced on the outcome of a proceeding you can only partially control. I went asleep every night during those 3 years thinking about the case, and I woke up every morning thinking about the case, and in between I dreamed about it, or I dreamed about the absence of it, which is not the same as peace. My attorney took 312 depositions total. Richard's side took 141. We produced over 40,000 pages of documents in response to discovery requests. My employees were deposed, people who had been loyal and hardworking and who had nothing to do with any of this, who had to take time away from their families and their jobs to sit in a conference room and answer questions from a lawyer who was trying to find something useful in their answers. One of my project managers, a man named Deshawn who had been with me for 9 years, called me after his deposition and said, "Danny, I just want you to know I told them exactly what happened, which is nothing happened." I thanked him, and I meant it more than I could say. The uncertainty alone does damage that's hard to quantify. Clients who might have hired us didn't, because they didn't want to be associated with a company in active litigation. A hospital system in Chandler that we had been in serious conversations with about a 3-building expansion project quietly stopped returning our calls 3 weeks after the lawsuit became public record. A school district construction contract we had been shortlisted for went to a competitor. I didn't chase those. I understood. Nobody wants the complication. By the end of the 2nd year, I had spent over $800,000 in legal fees. I had taken out a second mortgage on my home. I had reduced our workforce from 212 employees to 109, and I had done it by laying off people I had hired personally, people whose names I knew and whose kids' names I knew, people who had given me their best years and trusted me to take care of them in return. Every one of those conversations was a small death. I sat across from people in my office and told them that I was sorry and that this wasn't their fault and that I would give them every reference I could. And then I sat alone after they left and felt the specific particular shame of a person who has failed people who depended on him through no fault of his own, but whose conscience does not accept that distinction easily. Richard's legal team was well-funded and thorough. He had hired a forensic accountant named Marcus Tile, an expert witness who had testified in dozens of commercial litigation cases, and had a talent for making complex financial narratives accessible and damning. Marcus Tile spent 2 days on the stand walking the jury through 18 years of Marsh Brothers Construction's financial records, and what he described was not what I recognized. What he described was a company whose finances had been subtly manipulated, whose records showed patterns consistent with internal diversion of funds, whose audit trail had been, in his professional opinion, selectively managed to obscure beneficial payments to one partner at the expense of the other. None of it was true. I sat at the defendant's table and listened to an expert describe my company, the one I had built from nothing, as a vehicle for my own enrichment at my brother's expense, and I felt something I had no preparation for. I felt my reality being publicly replaced with another reality. I felt the ground of what I knew to be true become suddenly contestable, suddenly something that required proof I wasn't sure I could provide with sufficient conviction to 12 people who had no particular reason to believe me over a professional forensic accountant. The software claim was the most dangerous. Richard's technical expert, a software engineer with a PhD and a long list of consulting credits, testified for 2 days about source code and version control logs and developer attribution metadata. He explained, with impressive technical fluency, how the evidence in the code's history suggested that its foundational architecture had been developed by a single individual working independently before the company's formal operations began, and that subsequent contributions from company resources were layered on top of this independently developed core. He concluded that the software was, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty, Richard Marsh's independent intellectual property. I had been using that software for 5 years. I had always understood it to be a company tool, developed with company resources belonging to the company. That had been my assumption from the beginning, an assumption I had never questioned because it had never occurred to me to question it. My own technical expert tried to rebut the analysis, but I could see the jury's eyes losing focus during his testimony, and I understood in a way I hadn't before how much technical complexity can work against you in a courtroom when the other side has already given the jury a simpler story to hold on to. My attorney, Thomas Wakefield, a careful and experienced commercial litigator whom I trusted completely, had started shifting his language in our private conversations by the time we were in the 3rd week of trial. The shift was subtle, the kind that someone who wasn't listening closely might miss. He was no longer talking about the strength of our position. He was talking about the importance of how I presented on the stand. He was talking about jury perception and narrative clarity and the difficulty of countering expert testimony with competing expert testimony on highly technical subject matter. What he was not saying directly, but what I heard underneath his careful words, was, "We may be in trouble. I refuse to discuss settlement." He raised it twice, gently, the way a good attorney raises something his client doesn't want to hear. I told him both times that I was not going to pay Richard money that I did not owe him, that I was not going to sign a settlement agreement that implied I had done what he said I did, that I would rather lose at trial than buy my way out of a lie. Tom respected that. He didn't push it again. The jury deliberated for 3 days. I spent those 3 days in a state that I can only describe as a kind of suspended animation. I went home each night. I sat with Sarah. I ate food I could not taste. I watched television I could not follow. I slept in pieces, waking at 2 and 4 in the morning to stare at the ceiling and run the trial backward through my mind, looking for the moment I could have done something differently, said something more convincing, found a way to make 12 strangers understand what I knew to be true. On the third day of deliberation, the jury came back. They found in Richard's favor on 3 of 4 counts. The damages award was $5.1 million. The sound in the courtroom when the verdict was read was very small. There was no drama, no gasp, nothing like what you see in movies or television courtroom dramas where the crowd reacts and the judge bangs the gavel and the defendant's face crumbles beautifully in high definition. There was just the clerk reading numbers in a flat, practiced voice, and the quiet shuffling of papers, and the enormous impersonal machinery of the legal system doing what it does, adjudicating, concluding, moving on. My attorney put his hand briefly on my shoulder and said something that I did not hear. I watched his mouth move and understood that he was saying something meant to be comforting, and I could not make myself process what it was. Richard, at the plaintiff's table, had his head bowed and his hands folded on the table in front of him, the posture of a man receiving a long-awaited gift with appropriate humility, with the performance of a man who had thought carefully about how he would look when he won. I could see, from where I sat across the room, that his jaw was working. He was fighting back a smile with everything he had. He was, in that moment, still managing his presentation even as he celebrated privately, and I understood in a flash of unexpected clarity that this ability to manage presentation even while experiencing strong private emotion was what had made him such an effective liar for 3 years. He had practiced control his whole life and was using it now in its most impure form. The judge left the bench. The courtroom began to empty. I stood up because you stand up, because your body knows what to do even when your mind has gone somewhere else entirely. And I walked out of the courtroom and sat down on the bench in the hallway because I had nowhere to go that felt any better than that bench. I want to tell you about the particular quality of the humiliation I felt in that hallway, because it wasn't just the loss. Losing a lawsuit for something you didn't do is devastating, but the devastation I've described, the money, the employees, the company, those are practical losses, enormous but comprehensible. What I felt on that bench was something different. It was the loss of the right to my own narrative. For 3 years, my brother had been standing in front of judges and lawyers and a jury and telling them a story about who Daniel Marsh was, what Daniel Marsh had done, how Daniel Marsh had betrayed the person who trusted him most. And the system had looked at both versions of reality, mine and Richard's, and had chosen his. That is a specific kind of pain that I don't think has a name. The pain of having your version of events about your own life declared officially incorrect. Of having 12 strangers who had no reason to lie about it decide that the person who had lied about you was more credible than you. It made me question things I had been certain of. It made me go back through memories I had never doubted and wonder if I was misremembering them. This is what a skilled, sustained, well-resourced lie can do to a person who knows the truth. It can make you uncertain of the truth. It can make the ground of your own experience feel unstable. I am telling you this because I think it is the most important part of the story, more important than the reversal and the vindication, because it is the part that reveals what this kind of betrayal actually costs. I was sitting there in that specific, nameless pain when my phone buzzed. And I want you to understand that what happens next is not a dramatic invention. It happened. I was there. And even now, having lived it, I find it difficult to believe it happened as fast as it did. My phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't have in my contacts. The message said, "Check your email. Right now, it's important. Don't leave the courthouse." I almost put the phone back in my pocket. I was in no condition to process anything new. But the message said don't leave the courthouse, and something about that specificity, not just check your email, but the additional instruction, the way it anticipated what I was about to do, made me open my email. There was a message with the subject line. "I worked on the software documentation with Richard Marsh. You need to read this." The sender's name was Kevin Ostrowski. I will tell you what was in that email as completely as I can, because it is the pivot point of everything, the moment when the weight of 3 years of loss began its slow reversal. Kevin Ostrowski was a 43-year-old software developer from Tempe who had worked, several years earlier, as a contractor for a tech consulting firm. He had been approached individually, outside of normal professional channels, by Richard Marsh. Richard had reached out to him directly through a mutual connection and asked him to assist with a sensitive project. Specifically, to help construct and backdate documentation for a software development process, creating a paper trail that would establish, falsely, that the bidding software had been developed by Richard independently before Marsh Brothers Construction existed as a company. Kevin had been paid in cash. He had signed what Richard had characterized as a standard NDA. He had done the work. He had been troubled by it. He had tried to tell himself that he didn't know enough about the legal context to know what the documentation would be used for. He had tried to tell himself that he'd just been paid to do a technical job. He had tried, for years, to keep the whole thing in a box in the back of his mind where he wouldn't have to look at it. And then he'd seen the Phoenix News coverage of the verdict that afternoon. He had watched a segment in which a reporter stood on the steps of the Maricopa County Courthouse and described the $5 million judgment against Daniel Marsh in the lawsuit brought by his brother Richard. And Kevin Ostrowski had gone home, sat down at his kitchen table, and decided he was done keeping secrets. He had saved everything. He had kept all the emails between himself and Richard. He had kept records of the payments which had been made. And this is the detail that tells you everything about Richard's arrogance, through Venmo, of all things, with notes that said things like consulting fees. He had kept drafts of the documentation they had worked on together, files that contained in their version histories the actual timestamps of their creation, timestamps that made clear they had been produced years after the software was first used, not before. He had kept it all, he said in his email, because some part of him had always known that keeping it might matter one day. I read the email, and then I read it again, and then I called my attorney. Tom Wakefield is a measured man. He does not use profanity. He does not raise his voice. He speaks in complete sentences even when he is in a hurry. When I finished reading him the contents of Kevin's email, he was quiet for 4 seconds, which I counted, and then he said in a voice that was very carefully controlled, "Daniel, stay exactly where you are. I will be back inside that building in 3 minutes. Do not let anyone tell you the courthouse is closing." He was back in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. What happened next was something I had never seen and would not have believed possible before that day. Tom spent 50 minutes in a small conference room off the main hallway on the phone with Kevin Ostrowski, going through the documentation, asking detailed questions, verifying the specifics, building in his meticulous attorney's mind the architecture of what had been done and what could be proven. I sat outside in the hallway on a plastic chair that was not built for comfort and stared at the wall opposite me, at a framed photograph of the courthouse circa 1965, and I breathed. When Tom came out, his jacket was on and his briefcase was in his hand, and his face was the most carefully composed thing I had seen since the beginning of the trial. He sat down next to me and said, "His documentation is credible and it is comprehensive. We are filing an emergency motion to reopen before Judge Carver leaves the building." Judge Patricia Carver had presided over our trial. She was 61 years old, had been on the bench in Maricopa County for 22 years, and had a reputation that preceded her with a kind of reverence that experienced litigators reserved for judges who were genuinely difficult to predict because they were genuinely fair. She had no patience for wasted time and no tolerance for games, and she operated from a set of principles so clearly defined that lawyers who had appeared before her said you always knew exactly where you stood, even when where you stood was not where you wanted to be. I had found her presence in the courtroom consistently intimidating, even when she was ruling in my favor on procedural matters. Tom got the motion filed. I don't know exactly how, don't know what he said to the clerk or who he called, but I know that 37 minutes after the verdict had been handed down in the case of Richard Marsh versus Daniel Marsh, Judge Patricia Carver was back on the bench. Richard was in the parking garage. His attorney received a call that interrupted what I was later told had been a long, excited phone conversation with a real estate broker about a property in Scottsdale. Richard was in the middle of describing the kitchen he intended to renovate when his attorney told him he needed to return to the courtroom immediately. I did not witness this moment. I have only been told about it. But I have thought about it many times, the specific sensation of having a phone call about a kitchen renovation interrupted by the news that you need to go back to the courtroom where you just won $5 million. I was already in my seat when Richard came through the back door. He had his phone in his hand. He still had the slight flush of celebration on his face. He crossed the courtroom and I watched him, and I watched the moment, the precise, identifiable moment, when he saw my attorney's expression and Tom's posture and the set of my shoulders and the way I was sitting in my chair, not slumped as I had been an hour before, but upright, and he understood that something had changed. His flush faded. The smile he had not quite finished having disappeared. He looked at me and I held his gaze, and for 5 seconds I had my brother's full, unguarded attention, and then he looked away. Judge Carver entered, and we all rose, and she sat, and we sat, and she looked at both tables with the level, thorough gaze of a person who has seen most things and is prepared to deal with what she has not yet seen. She said she had reviewed the motion and the preliminary documentation submitted with it, and that what the court had been presented with, if substantiated, constituted grounds not merely for a new trial, but for a finding of fraud upon the court, which was among the most serious matters within her jurisdiction to address. She said she was reopening the proceedings effective immediately. She said both parties and all counsel were to make themselves available for an emergency hearing the following morning. She looked at Richard's attorney and told him that his client should make no assumptions about the permanence of the day's verdict. Then she looked directly at Richard. Judges rarely look directly at parties. They address counsel. But Judge Carver looked at my brother and she said, "Mr. Marsh, I want you to understand the gravity of what is now before this court." Richard said nothing. He had gone the color of old chalk. The emergency hearing the next morning lasted 11 hours. I sat through all of them. Kevin Ostrowski testified for 4 of those hours. He was a compact, slightly nervous man with thinning hair who rubbed the back of his neck when he was thinking through an answer, which I noticed he did often, and which made him look exactly like what he was. A person who had done something he was not proud of and was now dealing with the consequences of both the original act and the act of coming forward. He told the truth in the careful, slightly halting way of someone who has rehearsed their account many times but is still surprised by how heavy it is to say out loud. He described the approach from Richard. He described the nature of the work. He described being told the NDA he was signing was standard. He described the payments, and he submitted the records, and those records were real and they were documented, and they included, from the Venmo account history, Richard's own digital fingerprints on payments that could now be traced directly to a person who had been paid to falsify evidence in a civil lawsuit. Richard's attorney objected to the admission of the documentation on evidentiary grounds. Judge Carver overruled. He objected to Kevin's characterization of the work he had been asked to do. Overruled. He objected to the submission of version history data from the document files on technical grounds. Overruled. He objected so consistently that the rhythm of his objections started to feel less like legal strategy and more like the sound a person makes when they are holding back something they cannot otherwise express. Richard testified in the afternoon. He had spent the morning in a conference room with his attorney, and I don't know what they discussed, but I know it didn't save him. He took the stand and he was composed. He was always composed. Composure was Richard's greatest gift, and also, in this moment, one of the things that worked against him, because the composure read as coldness, and coldness does not generate sympathy from judges who are trying to determine whether you have committed a fraud upon the court. He denied everything in a careful, modulated voice. He said he didn't recall any arrangement with Kevin Ostrowski for the purposes Kevin had described. He said the documentation Kevin had submitted was being mischaracterized. He said the payments in the Venmo records were for legitimate consulting work related to technical aspects of the software that Kevin had genuinely assisted with. Tom Cross examined him for 2 hours. He went through the Venmo records item by item, date by date, amount by amount. He asked Richard to explain, for each payment, the specific work that had been performed and how that work related to any legitimate consulting engagement. Richard's answers grew slower. He asked for questions to be repeated. He looked at his attorney several times and received nothing useful in return. Judge Carver asked Richard directly whether he had engaged Kevin Ostrowski to alter or backdate documentation related to the software's development history. The question landed in the room with the clean, precise weight of something that has been aimed very carefully. There was silence, 7 seconds of it. Then Richard said he would prefer to confer with his attorney before responding. Judge Carver said, "You will answer the question, Mr. Marsh." 8 more seconds. In a courtroom, 8 seconds of silence is an eternity. Then Richard said quietly that he did not specifically recall the nature of the transactions in question. The judge's expression did not change. But something in the room changed. Something subtle and permanent, like a temperature dropping. The ruling came 6 days later. I was at home when Tom called. Sarah was at work. I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee I had made 2 hours earlier and not yet drunk, watching our neighbor's dog pace along the fence line with the patient, repetitive persistence of an animal who has decided that this particular fence is worth investigating indefinitely. Tom said, "Daniel, sit down if you're not already sitting." I said I was sitting. He took a breath and he said, Judge Carver had vacated the verdict in its entirety. She had found that the original verdict had been obtained through the fraudulent presentation of fabricated evidence, specifically the falsified documentation submitted in support of the software intellectual property claim, and that this fraud had materially influenced the jury's decision on all counts. She had awarded sanctions against Richard and his legal team. She had referred the matter to the Arizona Attorney General's office for investigation into obstruction of justice and fraud upon the court. She had ordered that all legal costs associated with the emergency proceedings be borne by Richard and his counsel. And she had awarded me, as the party who had prevailed in the post-trial proceedings, the recovery of attorneys' fees and costs associated with the entirety of the fraudulent action brought against me. I sat on my back porch for a long time after I put the phone down. The dog next door had stopped pacing and was sitting quietly in the corner of his yard looking at nothing in particular. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. The sky above Phoenix was the pale, washed-out blue it gets in late afternoon, not dramatic, just clean and very wide. And I looked at it and felt something that I want to be honest about, because honesty is the only thing this story has earned. What I felt was not triumph. I want to say that clearly because I think anyone hearing this story would reasonably expect triumph, would expect the relief and exhilaration of wrongdoing exposed and justice served, and the good man walking back into the sunlight vindicated. And there was some of that. There was a profound physical relief that loosened something in my chest that had been held tight for 3 years. But underneath the relief was something else, a hollowness. A silence where the resolution of the case had not yet filled in what the case had taken away. Because the reversal of the verdict did not give me back those 3 years. It did not restore the $800,000 in legal fees. It did not bring back the 47 employees I had let go over the course of the litigation, people with families and mortgages who had needed the stability I couldn't provide. It did not repair my marriage, which had survived but been strained to a place from which it took years of deliberate effort to fully return. It did not restore the years of my son's childhood that I had been partially absent from, not physically but mentally, because the case lived in my head like a permanent tenant who paid no rent and took up all the room. And it did not give me back my brother. Richard was charged by the Attorney General's office approximately 8 months after Judge Carver's ruling. The charges were fraud and obstruction of justice. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for a sentence of 3 years probation and a substantial fine. He served no prison time. Some people in my life were angry about this on my behalf, and I understood the anger, but I found I couldn't sustain it for him, couldn't maintain the necessary heat. By the time the criminal proceedings concluded, I had already begun the work of figuring out what came after, and that work required my full attention. I dissolved Marsh Brothers Construction and started over under my own name, Marsh Construction LLC. It is smaller than what we had. We have 60 employees now, roughly a third of our peak workforce, and I am at peace with that number. 60 people whose livelihoods depend on the company being run with honesty. 60 people who know that when I make a commitment, I keep it, and when I give you my word, you can build on it. I don't measure the company against what it was at its peak. I measure it against what it is now and what it is becoming, and by that measure it is growing steadily and on solid ground, which is the only kind worth building on. The rebuilding was not just professional. The rebuilding was personal. My marriage to Sarah survived the litigation, but it survived the way a structure survives a major storm, intact on the surface. With damage you discover slowly in the months afterward, when you are trying to live normally in a building that has shifted on its foundation. We went to counseling for a year after the verdict was overturned. I want to say that clearly, without embarrassment, because I think men of my generation were taught that counseling was something you needed only if something was fundamentally wrong with you. And I have learned that this is exactly backward. Counseling is something you need when something has been fundamentally hard, when you and another person have been through a significant trauma, and you do not want to let that trauma silently determine the shape of everything that comes after. We did the work. Sarah is the most patient and honest person I know, and what she did in those years, staying, believing me, choosing to keep choosing us even when the financial pressure and the emotional weight of the case made our household feel like a place of ongoing low-grade emergency. I cannot repay that. I can only try to be worthy of it every day going forward. I have thought a great deal in the years since about what justice actually is. Not justice as a legal concept, not justice as a verdict or a sanction or a judge's ruling, but justice as an experience, as something a person feels in their body and carries forward. I think justice is often smaller and stranger than we imagine it will be. I think it rarely arrives in the form we pictured. The verdict being overturned was justice in the legal sense, but it was not the restoration of what was lost. It was something more modest than that, and in some ways more real. It was confirmation, official and documented, that the truth had been the truth all along. That my memory of those years, my understanding of what I had done and not done was accurate. That I was not crazy. That I was not remembering wrong. That the ground I had been standing on was solid even when the court had briefly told me otherwise. Kevin Ostrowski. I want to spend some time on Kevin because he deserves it. A few months after the criminal proceedings concluded, I reached out to him. I asked if he'd be willing to meet for coffee. He said yes, and I could tell from the way he said it that he was nervous about seeing me, anxious about what I might say or feel about him. We met in a coffee shop in Tempe on a Saturday morning, and when he walked in, he looked like a man bracing himself for something uncomfortable. I told him I wasn't angry at him. I meant it. He had participated in what was done to me before coming forward, and I'm not going to pretend that didn't matter or that the participation carried no cost. It did. But he had come forward when he didn't have to. He had kept records that he could have destroyed at any time and saved himself a great deal of difficulty. He had chosen, at real personal and professional cost, to tell the truth. There are people who don't make that choice. There are people who live with what Kevin almost lived with, and they die with it, and the truth they swallowed dies with them. Kevin didn't let that happen. He stirred his coffee and stared at the table and said he should have come forward sooner. I told him that he had come forward when it counted. We both knew that was true and also slightly insufficient, and we sat with that for a moment in the way that honest people sit with things that can't be fully resolved. And then we talked about his kids and his work, and whether the Suns were going to do anything this season, and we parted as something close to friends. My son is 26 now. He works with me at Marsh Construction, learning the trade the way I learned it, from the ground up, physically, slowly. He is a serious and capable young man, and I am proud of him in a way that is difficult to articulate without sounding like every other father who has ever talked about his son. He knows the whole story. I told him everything when he was old enough to hear it plainly, not to process my emotions through him or to make him choose sides, but because I believed he would encounter versions of this story in his own life. Betrayal from unexpected directions, the slow erosion of trust by someone who knows you well enough to exploit what they know, and I wanted him to have a map. He listened through the whole thing, and at the end he said, quietly, that he was proud of me. I did not handle that particularly well. I am not sure what I said. I remember looking at the table. He asked me recently how I kept from becoming bitter after everything that happened. I told him the truth. I did become bitter for a period. I became a person who flinched at trust, who waited for the floor to give way in every room, who heard the gap between what people said and what they meant with a new and exhausting clarity. I became slower to let people in, more careful about what I shared and with whom, more alert to the space between stated intentions and actual behavior. Some of that is wisdom. Some of what I learned in those years about reading people and protecting myself was wisdom I needed and was better for having, even though the way I learned it cost more than I would have chosen to pay. Not all damage is without value. Some damage teaches you things that comfort never could. But bitterness that outlives its usefulness becomes something else. It becomes a way of being in the world, a lens through which everything is filtered, and that filter eventually becomes the thing you are responding to rather than the actual world in front of you. I got to a point, I could not tell you exactly when, it was not a single moment but a gradual shifting of weight where I made a choice. Not a dramatic choice, not a declaration or a ceremony. Just a quiet, daily, deliberate reorientation toward the life I still had rather than the one that had been taken. Toward the people who had stayed rather than the one who had left. Toward the work I could still do and the company I could still build and the person I could still choose to be every morning on purpose. My niece Emma, Richard's daughter, who was 19 when the criminal proceedings concluded, wrote me a letter about a year after everything was over. A physical letter, handwritten on notebook paper, sent to my business address because I don't think she was sure if I wanted to hear from her. She wrote that she was sorry for what her father had done, and that she hoped I was doing well and that she thought about me sometimes. She did not defend her father, and she did not apologize for him in a way that minimized what he'd done. She just extended her hand across the distance that his choices had created, a small, brave gesture from a young woman who had not created that distance and did not deserve to live on one side of it. I wrote back the same week. I am not a demonstrative person by nature, not in writing, not out loud, but I tried in that letter to be clear. I was glad she had written. I wanted to know her. Whatever had happened between her father and me did not belong between us. We have had dinner 3 times since then. She is 22 now, sharp and thoughtful, and navigating the complicated work of loving a parent whose actions you cannot fully reconcile yourself to, and I recognize that work because I have done versions of it myself, in a different direction, for different reasons. I never told her what to think about her father. That was never my place, and it will never be my place. Family loyalty is something you earn over years, and it is not something I have any right to ask her to redirect. But I hope that knowing me, the uncle who sat across from her at a dinner table and asked about her classes, and listened to her answer, and ordered the same terrible dessert she ordered, because she said it was the best thing on the menu. I hope that gives her one data point in a more complete picture than the one her father constructed of who I was. I hope she sees in the simple fact of me being present that I am not the man he described. Richard and I have not spoken since the plea was entered. I do not know if we ever will. There are days when I think about calling him, and those days always end the same way. I think about what I would say, and I realize I do not know what there is to say that would be worth the saying, and I put the phone down. Maybe that changes one day. I have stopped pretending to know what I will or will not do, what I will or will not feel, when time has done more of its work. What I know is that I do not hate him. I want to be clear about that because I think it is the honest answer, and the honest answer is the only one worth giving. I did hate him, for a while, with the specific hot fury of someone who has been betrayed by a person they loved and trusted. But hate at that temperature cannot be sustained indefinitely without burning you as badly as it burns the person you direct it toward, and I am not willing to carry that cost. What I feel now is something quieter and harder to name, a kind of grief. The grief of a thing that cannot be recovered, a relationship that was real for many years and is now something else, something that has no clear category and no clean resolution. I carry it the way you carry any unresolvable loss, not constantly, not painfully most of the time, just present somewhere the way all true losses are present. Here is what I do know. I know who I am. I am Daniel Marsh. I am 53 years old, and I build things, and I keep my word, and I show up, and I pay what I owe, and I don't take what isn't mine. These sound like ordinary things, the basic requirements of a decent life, and in some sense they are. But I have now been through a test of those things that most people never face. I have had my version of events placed on a scale against someone else's lie and watched the lie win, officially and publicly. And I have had to sit with that and continue to be myself inside it. And then I have watched the truth, patient as my mother always said it was, come forward on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of an email from a stranger who couldn't carry a secret anymore. I want to say something about what it costs to refuse the settlement, because I think it is the decision in this story that people most underestimate. My attorney raised it twice. He raised it carefully and professionally, as a responsible attorney should, because he could see that the trial was going badly and he wanted me to have the option to limit the damage. The settlement would have been in the range of $800,000 to $1.2 million, significant but far less devastating than a $5 million verdict. I could have written the check, walked away, rebuilt without the verdict on the record, never had to sit on that bench in that courthouse hallway feeling erased. I said no both times. I said no because to sign a settlement was to say, with the force of a legal agreement, that I had taken from my brother. And I had not taken from my brother, and I was not willing to say that I had in any document at any price under any circumstances. That is a harder choice than it sounds in retrospect, when the verdict has been vacated and the truth is documented and the story has an ending. In the middle of it, refusing the settlement meant choosing the possibility of a $5 million judgment over the certainty of a manageable payment. My attorney looked at me and said he respected my position but wanted me to be sure. I told him I was sure. The refusal was, I believe now, what the whole preceding 30 years of who I was had been building toward. Every morning my father went to work with a packed lunch. Every Thursday I drove my mother to chemotherapy. Every year I showed up for my cruise and kept my word to my clients. I had been building a self that was capable, when it came to the test, of refusing that settlement. I am glad I built it right. That patience is not nothing. That patience is not nothing. That patience is not passive. Waiting for the truth to matter is its own form of action. You wait by not becoming the thing that has been done to you. You wait by refusing to fabricate your own version of events that serves you better than the facts. You wait by keeping records because Kevin Ostrowski kept records. You wait by staying in the room because I stayed on that bench. You wait by not buying your way out of a lie with a settlement check. The waiting is its own testimony, its own proof of who you are. I think about my father. Gerald Marsh, the man who ate packed lunches for 31 years and drove the same model truck and never took a vacation that involved an airplane and died with $2 million and a legacy of absolute, unremarkable daily integrity. He didn't make speeches about it. He didn't have a philosophy. He just was who he was every day, regardless of who was watching. I think he would have been broken by what happened between his sons. I think it would have hurt him in a way he never would have expressed, because expressing hurt was not something Gerald Marsh did, not because he lacked feeling, but because he came from a generation of men for whom feeling and expressing were understood to be separate operations, and you could do the first without necessarily doing the second. But I also think he would have understood, without my having to say it, why I sat on that bench instead of walking out, why I refused the settlement, why I was still there when the phone buzzed. He would have understood it the way he understood everything important, quietly, without comment, with a nod that meant more than most people's speeches. Because some things are not about money. Some things are about whether the story you tell yourself about who you are is true. And Gerald Marsh raised a son who needed that to be true. There is one more thing I want to say before I speak directly to those of you who might be in the middle of your own version of this story. It is about the inheritance. The $2 million that set this in motion, the money my father left in equal shares to two sons, one of whom could not accept equal as sufficient. I used my inheritance to fund the early years of Marsh Brothers construction. I put it into the business, into equipment and payroll and operating costs. The way you do when you're building something and you need capital and you have it available. By the time the lawsuit was filed, that money had been absorbed completely into the company's growth. By the time the legal fees were finished, I had spent roughly twice that amount defending myself against a lie that my father's money had indirectly helped to enable. Because without the inheritance, there would have been no restructuring demand. Without the demand, there would have been no refusal. Without the refusal, there would have been no lawsuit. I have turned this over in my mind many times. I have sat with the thought that my father, who saved money carefully his entire life in order to give his sons something, inadvertently gave one of them a grievance that cost the other everything. I don't know what to do with that thought. I haven't found a way to resolve it. I just carry it, the way you carry things that don't have resolutions, gently, without trying to make it mean more than it means. What I know is this. My father left his money in equal shares because he believed his sons were equal. He was right. The fact that Richard could not accept that equality is not my father's failure. It is a failure of character that belongs entirely to Richard, and whatever peace Richard has or has not made with it is entirely between Richard and whatever quiet accounting he does with himself in the dark. The other thing I want to address, because I know it is what some of you are thinking. Did I pursue Richard? Did I sue him back? Did I seek damages for what he had done to me? My attorney and I discussed it seriously. There were grounds. There were real documented grounds for a malicious prosecution claim, and the court's findings in the post-trial proceedings would have supported that claim substantially. Tom laid it out for me. He explained what we could pursue, what the realistic range of outcomes was, what the timeline would look like. He said the case had merit and he would take it if I wanted to proceed. I did not proceed. I made that decision after about 3 weeks of thinking it through, and it was not a decision made from generosity or forgiveness, because I was not in a generous or forgiving mood. It was a decision made from exhaustion and from a particular kind of self-knowledge. I knew that to pursue Richard legally would be to spend another 2 or 3 years of my life with Richard at the center of it. I would have to prepare documents and give depositions and sit in courtrooms and think about him and talk about him and be in proximity to him and everything connected to him. And I had already given him 3 years. I was not willing to give him 3 more. Some people in my life thought I was wrong to walk away. A few people told me directly that I was letting him off too easily, that a man who fabricated evidence and suborned perjury and spent 3 years trying to destroy his own brother deserved to face the full consequences available to him. I heard those arguments and I understood them, but I knew that the full consequences available to me in a second round of litigation were not the same thing as justice, and they were not what I needed to move forward. What I needed was space. Distance. The ability to look ahead rather than backward. I chose that over the satisfaction of a second verdict, and I do not regret it. If you are in the middle of something like what I went through, if someone has lied about you, cheated you, weaponized your trust, turned your own history into evidence against you, I want to say something to you directly and without the comfort of easy reassurance. I am not going to tell you it will definitely work out. I am not going to tell you the truth always wins, because I know that isn't always so, and telling you that would be a comfortable lie, and I have had enough of those. What I will tell you is that the only thing you can control is who you are while you're waiting. You can be the kind of person that a Kevin Ostrowski feels compelled to send an email to. You can be the kind of person whose opponent, when a judge asks them a direct question under oath, has no good answer. You can build steadily and without drama the actual record of your actual life and trust that actual records are harder to falsify than people assume. I also want to say this: ask for help. I was stubborn about this and it cost me. I am by nature a person who handles things internally, who does not burden others with my difficulties, who was raised by a man who went 30 years without telling his wife how much money was in the brokerage account because he didn't want to worry her about numbers. That tendency served me in some ways. It cost me in others. During the litigation, I needed people around me who knew what I was going through, who could sit with me in the weight of it, and I kept too much of it to myself for too long. The people who showed up when I finally let them, my attorney, Sarah, a handful of friends who had known me long enough to be trusted with the truth, those people were not a burden on me. They were load-bearing walls. Let people be load-bearing walls. That is what they are there for, and keep records. I cannot say this strongly enough to anyone who hears this story and thinks, I hope I never need that advice. You may never need it. But if you do need it and you don't have it, you will understand in the most painful possible way what Kevin Ostrowski's careful file-keeping meant to a man sitting on a bench in a courthouse hallway with a $5 million verdict against him. Keep your emails. Keep your contracts. Keep your payment records. Document your decisions and the reasoning behind them, not obsessively but consistently. You are building a record of your life whether you intend to or not. Build it consciously. Build it in a way that tells the truth. And sometimes, not always, not without cost, not cleanly, the judge calls them back. Before I let you go today, I need to say something directly to everyone watching this right now. If this story hit you somewhere real, if it reminded you of someone in your life or something you've been through or something you're in the middle of right now, please hit that subscribe button before you leave this page. I'm serious about this. Not because of algorithms, though the algorithm is real and it matters, but because this channel exists to tell stories like this one. Long, honest, complicated stories about what it actually costs to be a person of integrity and what you sometimes get back for that cost. And the only way we can keep doing it is if people like you decide it's worth supporting. Hit subscribe. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. It takes 5 seconds and it means something real to everyone who makes this channel possible. I want to be direct with you about what this channel is trying to do because I think you deserve to know. We are not here for easy stories. We are not here for stories where the villain is cartoonishly evil and the hero is spotlessly pure and the resolution is clean and complete and costs nothing. Those stories are comfortable, but they are not true, and what most of us need is not comfort, it's recognition. We need to see our own complicated, costly, unresolved experiences reflected in someone else's story and hear that the person came through it. That is what we are building here. That is what your subscription supports. So if you believe in that kind of storytelling, subscribe now and tell your people about us. And right now in the comments below, I want you to tell me your name and the city you're watching from. That's all I'm asking. Just your name and your city. Because every time I scroll through those comments and I see someone in Lagos or London or Louisville or Lahore or right here in Phoenix watching this video on their phone at midnight, It reminds me of something important that is easy to forget in a world that feels increasingly fragmented and isolated. We are not alone in our hard things. Other people have been lied about by people they loved. Other people have sat in a courtroom watching a false version of themselves be declared the official truth. Other people have had to rebuild from nothing again after doing everything right. Tell me where you are. Let me know you're out there. Tell me your name and your city in the comments right now. And if you felt something in this story, if it moved you or provoked you or made you think of someone who needs to hear it, share it with that person today. You know who I'm talking about. You thought of them while you were watching. Send it to them. Not because this channel needs the views, though it does, but because the person you're thinking of might be on their own bench right now, feeling erased, feeling like the official version of events has been declared against them, and what they need more than anything is to know that the bench is not the end of the story. Now, before I let you go completely, I want to say one last thing about my brother. Richard Marsh is 61 years old. I do not know what his daily life looks like. I do not track him. I do not follow him on social media. I do not ask mutual family members for updates. I hear things occasionally that he has remarried, that he relocated out of state, that he is working in commercial real estate, which is where he started before we built the company together. I cannot confirm any of it, and I do not try. That part of my attention belongs somewhere else now. What I do think about sometimes is whether he thinks about that afternoon, whether he replays it. The Italian suit, the phone call in the parking lot to the real estate agent about the kitchen renovation, the attorney calling him back, walking back through that courtroom door and seeing me already in my seat and understanding in an instant that something had changed. I wonder whether that sequence of events, the celebration, the reversal, the chalk-colored face, visits him at night. I wonder whether shame is available to him, or whether the construction of that lie over all those years required him to dismantle the machinery that shame runs on. I genuinely do not know. And I have made a kind of peace with not knowing that feels most days like enough. What I know with clarity is that I am not who he said I was. I know this not because a judge vacated a verdict, though she did. I know it because 60 people show up to Marsh Construction every morning and trust me to lead a company with honesty. I know it because my son watches how his father moves through the world and is learning from it. I know it because Emma wrote a letter and I wrote back, and we have had dinner, and she is becoming someone I am proud to know. I know it because Sarah is still across the kitchen table, and the house is paid down, and the second mortgage is gone, and when I wake up in the morning, I know who I am, and I do not have to spend any energy pretending. Those are not abstract victories. They are the actual substance of a life well returned to after significant damage. They are what the bench was for. They are why you stay in the room. Next week, we have a story that I have thought carefully about how to tell. It is about a woman who discovered, after 17 years of marriage, that her husband had been maintaining a parallel financial existence since before their wedding day. Not an affair, exactly, something stranger, and in many ways more destabilizing, because it was not about love or desire, but about control. About a man who could not fully surrender the private sovereignty of his money even to the person he had chosen to spend his life with. What she did when she finally stopped pretending she didn't already know, and what it cost her to stop pretending, and what she found waiting for her on the other side of that cost. It is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories of personal courage I have come across in all the years I have been doing this, and I think you're going to be sitting very still while you hear it. We'll see you next week. My name is Daniel Marsh. I build things. I kept my word. And I'm still standing.